Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. I know that was a lot to digest, a lot to take in the last video, but I wanted you all to see just how well preserved the Old Testament is. Again, just maybe a quick recap of what we talked about. The oldest complete Hebrew a copy of the Old Testament is dated around 1000 AD, and that was written or copied by a group of people called the Masoretes. Okay, so this is also known as the Masoretic text, and that was the oldest copy that we had until 1947 when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And those were written around 200 BC. So those were written, 1200 over 1200 years before the Masoretic text was written, and what was neat was that we were able to then compare the two and see just how well preserved the Old Testament really was over that long span of time. And what we found was almost perfect accuracy. It was something like 95% identical, and that 5% that was different were minor differences in spelling, okay, and grammar issues that didn't affect the meaning of the text at all. And again, these are things that you can research on your own. In fact, the Masoretic text is being kept in St. Petersburg, Russia, in the Russian National Library. All right, so you can go and look this up. But what I want you also to note, I want to add a couple of things to think about. That first of all, the Masoretic text it is the oldest complete copy, okay, of the Old Testament. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls wasn't perfectly complete because it was missing the book of Esther, okay, but that's a relatively small portion of the Old Testament missing. But the Masoretic text is the oldest complete copy of the Old Testament in Hebrew. But what I didn't mention in the last video is that the Masoretes also made many other copies of the Old Testament just in fragments, not necessarily complete copies. So you have other collections of Old Testament documents, like the Cairo Codex. Okay, that was written around 895 AD, and that contains books like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and all the minor prophets. Okay, all those are currently kept at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. You also have the Leningrad Codex of the Prophets, which contains Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the minor prophets. You have the British Museum Codex, which contains Genesis 39 through Deuteronomy 1. Okay, and there are also many, many other collections of fragments. One collection known as the Cairo Genisa was found in a guy's attic in Cairo, Egypt, in the year 1890, and it contained 10,000 biblical fragments. Okay, and that's just really, really impressive because it shows again how well preserved these Old Testament texts were, and all of these can be compared across the board to make sure that they were copied accurately. Now, what I also want to note is that all of those things that I've been talking about from the Masoretes, those were all copies copies of the Old Testament in the original language, in the original Hebrew. What I didn't mention is that there were also copies of the Old Testament, even complete copies of the Old Testament, copied into other languages, like the Septuagint, for instance. That's the Old Testament translated into Greek, and that was actually translated around 250 BC. Okay, so that was translated a long time ago, and we can use that as a point of comparison, and it's very similar to the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. Obviously, there's going to be some minor and very slight differences whenever you translate into a different language, but the meaning wasn't lost at all. In fact, most of the New Testament writers, when they quote from the Old Testament, they're quoting from the Septuagint, from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But you also have translations into Syriac and Latin, and Aramaic and Coptic and Ethiopian and Armenian and Arabic. Okay, I just want you all to see just how well kept and well preserved the Old Testament is. Even people who don't believe in the Bible, or who even are hostile toward the Bible, and they just hate it and they want to disprove it, they can't deny how well preserved the Old Testament is. There's just no denying it when it comes to a textual criticism standpoint. If somebody's going to objectively look at this without bias, there's just no doubt the Old Testament really has been kept well. And so we can be confident that the Old Testament text that we have today in its original language has been well preserved, and we can count on it for our use in our translations. I hope that that's helpful, and Lord willing, I'll see you next time.